This video was recorded on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/actualjusticewarrior. If you like what you see, consider giving me a follow over there. And if you really like it, go over there and subscribe. You can subscribe for free with an Amazon Prime subscription as long as you're already a Prime member. Support the channel and do so without costing you a thing. Can't get better than that. So what is up, guys? I have a very special treat for you guys here. I have Ryan Lazarus. He is formerly of Subverse, now a part of Scanner. He's a podcast host, a journalist. He actually goes out into the street and he interviews people in all these crazy, ridiculous events just to get the footage. He puts himself in harm's way for your entertainment and for your knowledging pleasure, because that's what journalism is about, is informing you guys. And he's decided to take time out of his busy day and join me here live on Twitch to talk to you guys a little bit about what he's doing and a little bit about what he's going to do in the very near future. So please welcome Ryan Lazarus.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
No problem, no problem. I was gonna say I haven't talked to you in almost a year, I think.
Yeah, it's since last August when we were at the Minds.com IRL event, and that was certainly a fun experience. Something I'll certainly never forget. But I was laughing while you were introducing me because I was thinking about all the stuff that Subverse News and what's now Scanner has done over the past year. A lot of people that have gone to like some really crazy protests and riots over the past year, especially Emily Molly, who did multiple trips to Hong Kong during some of the worst parts of the protests there when they're really starting to clamp down. But I was thinking about myself. I live in Chicago, and back in November, there was an anti-Trump rally because Trump was coming to visit, I think for his first time since he got elected, I believe. And there was a bunch of protesters that came to, they basically shut down the Loop, the heart of downtown. And it was very tame back then. And I was thinking, it was fun for me to do to cover my first like protest. But then I was thinking about my colleague, Emily, and oh man, the stuff she had to endure, or, other people, for journalists to go to conflict zones and stuff like that. So the stuff that I've had to go through, it's been pretty tame. So I'm thankful I haven't gone to any places where I felt like I might actually die. But now what's happened in Chicago recently, other protests and riots and stuff, things have certainly gotten a little more serious. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a difference in scale between like an authoritarian government and the rioting that we're seeing now, as bad as it is. But don't think I didn't see footage of people in Chicago bringing U-Hauls to go loot. Like, if you're out there covering that, there is a level of danger there. I've seen other journalists get hurt out there. I've seen people have guns pointed at them. Obviously, people have been shot at some of these events. So, I mean, it is serious.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely no joke. I mean, especially now, how much things have changed. Like I said, when I was covering the story back in November, it's amazing how quickly things have changed. Like, there was still a lot of tension back then, but there was no violence. Nothing was really broken. It was just mobs of people marching down the streets. And once COVID hit, like, everything is just accelerated and gotten crazy. So long term, or I should say more near term, I think things are going to get really crazy. They could get even worse for quite a while, but at some point, I think things will start to settle, but only after things get really ugly, which is weird for me to say because I'm generally a huge optimist, but I've had a huge interest in a while of trying to find ways to de-radicalize people, get people to chill out and have better discussions with other people. And I feel like that timeline has just been erased. What I thought could be maybe changed in years, COVID has just closed that gap. And with the election now approaching, I can only imagine what happens if Trump wins or if it's contested. I mean, I always feel like the election is going to be contested no matter what.
Right.
But if it appears as if Trump is the winner, at least on that night, excluding what's going to happen with the mail-in voting, cities are going to burn. Like, I have zero doubt in my mind that that's going to happen. If Biden looks like a clear winner, like just a huge landslide, I don't think the cities will burn right away. I think people might pause, but I don't expect things to change. And then you're going to see more police shootings or other forms of brutality and just other chaos. And now it's just become kind of culturally acceptable, at least for enough people, for them to cause enough problems. And it's a shame because, I mean, I think what's going on with the police, I'm a huge critic of cops. Like, honestly, it's hard to find someone who's a bigger critic than me. But the way that people are trying to enact change, it's actually just reinforcing people that want more policing. And it's understandable when you see, cities burning and all this chaos that's spreading to suburbs and elsewhere. It's hard to have a conversation about, like, what are ways to fix the cops when you can't even keep your society stable to begin with. And if the cops are the symbol for that, it's almost like the people that say they want police reform are actually the ones that don't want it, because it doesn't seem like we're going to get it if they keep doing this. It's heartbreaking.
Right.
It's a shame.
I agree with you there. I am in favor of certain police reforms, and I thought to myself, there's rioting right now. This is the number one problem because it's happening right now. But eventually, when this calms down, I would like to make a video discussing some of the things I do think we should reform about policing. But we're 100 days out and it hasn't stopped. And I agree with you that if the election is contested or it's not clear who the winner is, then we're going to have big problems in this country, because we've been hearing nonstop about Russia collusion in the election and about how it's not legitimate. And Trump's been saying, well, it's not going to be legitimate because of the mail-in voting. And, like, everybody in the left is already thinking it's not legitimate. They think the last one's not legitimate. And I think back to this moment of Election Day 2016, where I forgot which news channel I was watching, but it was clear that Trump had won via the Electoral College, and Hillary hadn't given a concession speech. So the guy on the news, it was like ABC or NBC, was like, well, is Trump going to wait for Hillary to concede, as is tradition, or is he going to come out and declare himself the winner? And considering this year with the mail-in voting, we're expecting the results like maybe a week or 2 weeks out. And I knew right then and there that, of course, Trump is going to declare himself the winner. If he does that again and the votes aren't in, then it's going to be chaos in the streets, and his supporters are going to be angry as well, because they're going to think that Trump said he won, therefore he won, and anything after that is the election being stolen from him. Like, what do you think about that idea that not having the results is going to be, just based on the people involved, is going to be extra chaotic, even more so than 2000 election?
So, from my observations of how the left operates and a lot of complaints about the right, is that the right seems to be fairly tame. I know most people will point to, well, what about Charlottesville? And that was terrifying. But outside of that, most of your general Trump supporters, they're not looking for trouble. They're not looking to start burning things down. But now what's been escalating, and especially in cities like Portland, seeing how far people in Antifa or associated with Antifa, it's inviting more people from the right to escalate things. And between the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting and I've seen your coverage on that. I mean, as far as my look at what happened in Kenosha, I think he's going to get off with self-defense. I don't think it was good for him to be there. I mean, the whole situation is a complete mess. But the fact that he was running away from people that were trying to take his gun or were trying to hurt him, then only fired once he was cornered or when he had fell, I don't think he's going to be prosecuted, or at least he won't be convicted.
Right.
After seeing the response from so many people on the right that I mean, I see some really spicy memes people are passing around uh, about Rittenhouse and how people admired him. And I know some of it was just jokes, but then you have other people who are like, hey, I wouldn't mind going to, if there's something, nearby me, I'm going to show up with a gun. And if people attack me, I'm going to be prepared to shoot. And it only takes a handful of people to show up armed, ready to shoot, and from both sides before things really start to get, really ugly. If we think they're bad now, there's other people that talk about a civil war has been coming for a while, or in some ways we are in the beginning of one. It's something I've thought for a while, and I've wanted to avoid. I never thought that it was inevitable, and like I was saying earlier, I thought there would be more time to try and avoid these things, but between COVID and people being cooped up and just in a general state of panic, people losing their jobs, just so much uncertainty, and people spending more time on social media than they used to, where everyone's always talking about what's happening and people are fighting with each other and they're stressed out. It keeps amplifying it. So, to go back to what's going on with the election, if Trump looks like he lost, I don't think, like, and it looks like it's for certain, I don't see a lot of people on the right trying to do anything about it or to retaliate. But if it looks like it's been stolen, or if that's a narrative that seems somewhat plausible, there might be some people now that, because they've seen how far the left has gone, they might say, okay, well, maybe it's time for us to step up. And, there's a upcoming event in Portland that the Proud Boys are going to be demonstrating, and anytime they clash with Antifa, it's like, I don't know what's going to happen now. If things were bad, earlier this year, or past skirmishes they've had over the past couple of years, it's like now when tensions are higher than ever, I don't know, things get really wild.
I mean, look, I'm not a believer in the Civil War, and I hate the concept of like it being inevitable. Like, I think that is an inevitability fallacy. Like, we can always work things out and push back. And I agree with you. There are too many people lionizing Rittenhouse as some kind of a hero. Like, he defended himself.
Mm-hmm.
If he defended another person from these attackers, then I'd be more willing to throw that out there. But he defended himself. However, I do want to point out that some of the memes about how Rittenhouse should be training the police because that guy pulled out a gun on him and he shot that guy in the arm.
Yeah.
And that's what the left has been saying. Shoot him in the leg, shoot him in a non-fatal place, only use deadly force when absolutely necessary. And the kid was precise, to give him a little bit of credit in that situation. But obviously, the preferential situation is for you not to go out there, or if you are going to defend property with guns, then take a lesson from the LA riots and get on the roof of the building so you have all the deterrence with a 0% chance that somebody's going to be in a position to grab your gun. That's my general opinion. I know people are going to disagree with that, but I think Rittenhouse, while he legally acted in self-defense, while he morally was clearly defending himself, it's shown on the video, he could have possibly avoided that situation had he not been on the ground with these rioters.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I want to clarify, when I say civil war of something of that sort, I don't think it'll ever be something like what the American Civil War of the 1860s. It could just be small but repetitive skirmishes that happen between small factions that could persist for a while. But as far as like large scale armies, going head to head, I don't ever see anything like that.
Right. You're not in the camp that the Democratic Party is going to declare war on the Republican Party or vice versa. I understand what you're saying.
No, nothing of that sort. But I don't, at this point, I don't see how things start to de-escalate until things get like really bad, and then people are like, okay, now we need to reconsider. Because at least when the riots first started this year, so many people were justifying it, and then at least the left was justifying it until they noticed it was hurting them in the polls, and they're like, oh, okay, maybe we should stop doing this. Instead of thinking, I mean, I don't know how they didn't think this wasn't going to do well for them in the polls, you think it'd be fairly obvious, but I don't know, whoever is running the Democratic campaigns, just some simple advice to them. And this is free, but I think it's very valuable. Whatever those advisors are telling you to do the exact opposite, and that would be the right thing to do. Because I swear they are just the most miserably uninformed and delusional people. I don't know what they're doing. Just well, it makes no sense.
They were being led by the polling, because if you remember, Black Lives Matter was like the most popular organization right after George Floyd in the entire country. But there's just no political foresight, and like, put aside the moral implications of letting cities burn, the cities where these people live burn in order to help those people, like that ridiculous notion. Put that aside. But strategically, you have to know that rioting is bad. And when I remember knowing that they were in trouble when a professor came out and explained how rioting shaves off like 3 or 4 points in a presidential election for the Democrats. And instead of saying, oh, we should not riot, they canceled the guy who did that because they're like, what a racist. So that's how you knew that they were getting like high on their own stash, if to use the expression. But like, you're on the ground in Chicago. Like, what's the temperature from, like, because obviously some of these are more violent and get crazier than others, but what's the temperature of the ones that you've seen up close and personal, like whether they be protests or protests that have later evolved or devolved into riots?
Yeah, so back in June, after I'm trying to think what had sparked it, because this was after, at least a week after George Floyd had died, and I think maybe it was on a weekend. Someone had planned a march up and down Michigan Avenue. Now, if those who aren't familiar with Chicago, Michigan Avenue is more or less like the Fifth Avenue equivalent, if you're familiar with New York City. There's a lot of tourists that come there. It's known for top luxury shopping and good restaurants and all that kind of stuff, all near the area. It's also known as the Magnificent Mile. So there was a peaceful march that was going up Michigan Avenue, and I actually live on Michigan, and I went to go check it out for myself, and it was peaceful for the most part. The only thing I saw was there was some graffiti on the stores outside, which is not something I was used to seeing on the street that I've lived on for years. And eventually, after they walked the mile, they stopped to have someone go on a bullhorn and give a brief speech and kind of a quick rally. And they made, I thought, a lot of really great points about things that need to change with the police and how the system currently works. And everyone there seemed to be on the same page. And it was actually kind of, it made me feel happy. It was like, wow, okay, even though the stuff that happened in Minneapolis, like the riots really got out of control, it was nice to see Chicago, a city that I love and have lived in for over a decade, that maybe we can have some real reform. And about 5 minutes after that point, people started breaking shit. They started breaking in windows. They started looting these big stores. And over the course of hours and into the night, a lot of places started burning. And I remember going back the next morning and just getting a bunch of footage on the street and in the surrounding area. It was just a complete mess. And this has already been a very surreal year with COVID. As someone living downtown during lockdown, it's very strange to have a ghost city. A lot of my friends that live in Chicago, they don't live downtown. They ask me what's it like, downtown these days, and I would tell them imagine what it's like downtown at 3 a.m. except it's like that during the day. It's a very bizarre thing. So it's already been a surreal year, but then all of a sudden, now you see your street, it's typically empty. Now there's a bunch of people coming to see what has happened to the street, and the surrounding areas. There's people just walking past, taking pictures, just kind of in disbelief because no one had ever seen something like this. And, you know, I was hoping that this would just be, you know, a one-off thing. And, you know, fast forward like a month later, someone was shot by the cops on the south side. The initial report was an unarmed person was shot and killed. I think a 15-year-old was shot and killed by the cops.
They called him a 15-year-old, yeah.
Yeah, it turned out I think he was 20, and the guy had a gun, and he wasn't dead. But nonetheless, that was a rumor that spread. And overnight, there was a ton of rioting and looting on the street again. And someone actually lives in my building. I remember looking at a Twitter post taken from his window, a video. There's a hotel across the street. There's a bunch of people, and you hear like a dozen gunshots, and it was cops shooting at and getting fired at by one of the looters that was there. And it was at that moment I was like, to see this happen again, it was like, okay, this is now seeped into our culture as like, this is just going to be a normal thing. It's kind of like with school shootings. You know, a lot of people wonder why are school shootings so popular in the U.S. and not, they don't seem like they happen in a lot of other places, or not at the same rate. And I think it's the way it's been portrayed in the media. Like they get so hyped up that there's enough really deranged people out there to say, you know what, if I'm going to go out, I'm going to do it this way. And it's just become kind of sadly normal for people to do it that way. And it's kind of the same thing, I think, with these riots that people see. They feel validated. They see other people doing it across the country. And there was initially a lot of support for it, saying you need to be out in the streets doing these types of things. And as long as people feel justified, they won't feel evil. They won't feel like they've done anything bad. And actually, they'll feel like they're doing the greatest thing. And they will shame other people that aren't participating in it. And that's what's really terrifying.
Yeah, that was the Trevor Noah take, where he's like, people say, oh, don't riot and loot. It doesn't work. And he's like, well, not rioting and not looting also doesn't work. It's like, what are you doing? Like, you don't have to, nobody's looting Comedy Central and the Daily Show set. You're seeing people's businesses be destroyed after they were already destroyed by COVID. Like these, and I don't know if you've seen some of the reports on the insurance where they're like, you know, because everybody's like, insurance will pay for everything because that's that's everybody's experience with insurance. All these people, by the way, who more likely than not supported Bernie Sanders, who wanted to get rid of insurance because insurance doesn't pay for everything. And you look at the reports, and the insurance doesn't even cover bulldozing the condemned building, let alone rebuilding the store. And we have, you know, almost 100 buildings were destroyed in like the first week, not looted, completely destroyed in just Minneapolis. And people are pretending it's not happening. People are pretending that, or it's no big deal, or that it's justified. You see there, that NPR woman, she had a book in defense of looting, and it's crazy. It's like, you go loot and steal your own stuff. And one of the things that I don't think gets enough emphasis is that when your city's hit by a natural disaster, it takes about a year for the economy of that city to rebound. If your city's hit by rioting and looting, then that increases the cost of insurance going forward. That increases increases the cost of getting a loan to even start a business going forward. And it takes about 10 years for you to get back to where you were before, let alone have legitimate economic growth. And these are the same people that will not stop talking about redlining. Every single effect that they talk about as related to redlining is made significantly worse by looting. And unlike redlining, the looting is actually happening. So it's ridiculous. So like you're not only seeing these downtowns become ghost towns because of COVID, which by the way, we were watching it on TV in New York, Times Square, completely empty at 11 o'clock Saturday night. It's like a sight to be seen. I had friends in the film, who do independent film, going down there and getting B-roll for a zombie apocalypse movie. Like that's how serious it was. But we're not only seeing that, but they're like knowing that the destruction is also not likely to be rebuilt, or those people who had their stuff destroyed are likely to never become whole again, is also a tragedy on top of that on top of our cities becoming a place where people go to look at the horror instead of look at the beauty. So,
Yeah, for sure. So one term I've been using a lot lately, and I can't take credit for coining it. Someone came up with it a while ago, but Detroitification. I feel like that is what's going to happen to a lot or most, maybe all, major U.S. cities. And what I mean by that is, so with Detroit, it used to be, a wonderful, bustling city, and where it is now, it's depressing, how bad it's got, and it's gotten relatively better in the past couple of years, but that doesn't mean a lot when it was already so low to start with. So what happens is, when between COVID and the riots, who are the first people to leave? They're rich, the people that pay most of the local taxes. If they leave, tax base goes down, social services start to go down, a lot of more jobs leave, crime goes up, and more people leave, tax base goes down, crime goes up, and this spirals until you get something that looks like Detroit. And I don't think a lot of people, especially those that were promoting rioting, that they didn't see that this is the inevitable consequence when you normalize these things. And like you mentioned earlier with COVID, it was already bad enough. People were fleeing; they didn't want to deal with lockdown. But you've got so many businesses, especially like really big companies that have thousands of square feet of office space that they're saying they're not going to come back to. Like, even if COVID disappeared tonight, it would say we're going to stay virtual. They're noticing that they're actually more productive, and they can save a ton of money not having this lavish office space in places like Manhattan or downtown Chicago or something like that. So you amplify that with crime. No one's going to want to stay there. I mean, if people moved out, if they tried to convert office space into to residential, maybe that could be something that would happen over time. But now with rampant crime and rioting and stuff, it's hard to think that any of these cities, especially the ones on the coast and Chicago, it's often referred to the third coast.
right.
It's very similar to both the coasts, that people are moving to Colorado and Texas, Arizona, Nevada, places that seem to be a little more sane. But even for someone like myself, and I'm curious to hear your take, I've thought about leaving the country, at least for a little bit.
Yeah.
It's like I've never really thought about it until recently. I always thought I wanted to have a place here in Chicago, specifically. It has been such a wonderful place, but it's like now at this current moment, I started looking towards places in Central Europe and elsewhere. But yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah. No. If it weren't for the fact that my girlfriend, who I'm in like a long-term relationship with, works in an industry that's deeply tied to New York City, then I would have considered leaving the state or the country, for a lower tax state, or a lower tax city even. I'll even take some taxes by comparison. But yeah, there are
Sure.
definitely there's nothing keeping me here. Like, I have camera. Other than that, like, I have a camera, a microphone, and a laptop computer, and I can work from anywhere in the world as long as I have an internet connection. But a lot of people don't
Yep.
have that luxury and all that. But to get to your point about the hollowing out of major cities, the Detroit hollowing out started with the Detroit rioting in the 60s. Like, people forget this. And it's also like what happens when the tax base gets starts to diminish is that politicians panic and they start raising more and more taxes. So in Detroit, it's one of three cities in the
Yeah.
entire world where you pay taxes on your electric bill. Like, why would I want
Hmm.
to, if I'm paying a business tax, a city income tax, and on top of that I also have to pay taxes on the electricity that I use. Like, there's no reason to be there. And that's why
Mhm.
people, that's why Detroit used to have 2 million people living in it, and now it has under 800,000. It's just the policies that people use to in a panic after people flee due to big events like rioting also basically incentivize more people to leave. Like, it's insane.
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to ask you about. So we mentioned, Civil War. Like I said, I don't think there'll ever be something on the same magnitude, even close to what had happened in the 1860s. But I wouldn't be surprised if you started to see certain states leave the Union. I feel like now that there's so much tension, especially if there's a contested election, which that almost seems inevitable at this point. Both sides are kind of prepping us for that, it seems. Um, if so, right now the U.S. financially, you look at the national debt, how high it is, and how much more it's going to grow, especially with COVID making things even crazier. A lot of people said, well, inflation hasn't gotten out of control. Things are fine right now. But what happens if there's more instability here and people get more concerned about the debt? And right now, the U.S. is a reserve currency of the world. Well, what happens if people decide they don't want that anymore, or they start to diversify, or you see the price of gold and stuff like that going up, where there's more people saying, like, I don't know if the dollar standard is still viable, especially a decade from now. Will it still be the one reserve currency? I don't know if that's the case, and if that's broken up, what happens to the rest of the country? Do they want to pay for all of this crazy stuff that the government's been spending on for decades that it can't afford? And what happens when those interest rates spike and trying to pay off the debt becomes even harder? I think you're going to have some states, especially ones that are fairly fiscally responsible, say, I don't want to be involved in this anymore. And you add to the fact that people are just polarized to begin with, you might just say, I'm done.
Yeah. I mean, I think there would have to be a collapse of the U.S. federal government, or the collapse of the dollar, for states to start leaving the Union. The secession question, like it or not, has been settled in the Civil War. Like, if you try to leave the Union, then the federal government will send troops and invade your state and bring you back into the Union by force. So I don't know if that's going to happen per se, but to double on what you're talking about with the debt getting out of hand, I remember people got angry at me because I gave Trump a low grade for his first year, and I was like, number one issue is the spending. And I said in that video, like, what if there's an emergency that requires a giant, amount of debt to be taken on, and we're already blowing out the spending? Well, that emergency is here. We blew, like, what was it, over $2 trillion in that one stimulus bill, and now we're thinking about doing another. Like, that's going to have problems for generations, and I think our military alliance with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states is going to keep the dollar as the world reserve currency, but the bigger problem is right now interest rates are at all-time lows, and the amount of money that we're spending on debt service is still going higher and higher. If you were to just double that interest rate from, like, near 1% to 2%, then we're starting to spend closer to $1 billion. I'm sorry, closer to $1 trillion on debt service. So like, the spending is like the biggest long-term, and honestly it's a short-term problem, because if we don't get a handle over it now, then we're never going to be able to do that. But it's the biggest long-term problem for the United States of America. More important than any foreign government, more important than the rise of China, more important than all of that, because being a giant debtor nation is going to undermine our ability to deal with any of those problems worldwide, let alone the problems here at home that the federal government is supposed to be spending money on. So yeah, I could see that, but I think a financial collapse would have to come before people fleeing the Union. And then if people start leaving the Union, there's going to be a civil war, because it's like, how much debt are you trying to leave the Union? Like, if Texas leaves the Union and they don't want to take on any portion of the federal government's debt, like, wars have been started over significantly less.
Oh no, for sure. I mean, that's when things could get really crazy. But even if it didn't happen, there's going to be a lot of a huge urge to do it, and that's when I think you can still have these skirmishes that could happen, or they could get even worse. I think the only difference now, if the U.S., the federal government, tried to, I guess, reseed someone who seceded, people are, I mean, obviously they don't have super sophisticated military tools, But they can still do a lot of damage with the amount of weaponry that's out there. And it doesn't take, I mean, you look at how terrible the U.S. has done occupying places like Iraq and Afghanistan with people that have, they don't have a lot of advanced weaponry. And if you had, I guess, an insurgency in the U.S., they could withstand that, and they could just bury you because it's not financially stable. If someone, I imagine, and I'm getting super speculative here. I'm using my, I went to film school, so I always think of like crazy scenarios or stuff for a movie or for a TV show or something. But if there was some sort of civil war or a state tried to secede, you're going to have other countries that want to see the U.S. break up and be like, hey, here's some Stinger missiles or something of that sort. You know, they cost tens of thousands of dollars as opposed to something that can take out something that's worth tens of millions of dollars. And it's like, that's how the U.S. loses a lot of these wars, is that the cost of defense is so much cheaper than the cost of occupying and going on offense. It could cause a huge problem that could go on for a long time. So hopefully it never gets to that point. I don't think it's going to get there, but
even without like outside support, because then that gets into, you know, like, are you really trying to fund an insurgency against a nuclear power? Like that's a sketchy position to be in if you're a foreign power. But even without that, like, we've seen straight up an insurgent force with not very much outside funding or anything, just with, you know, like, just with the guns, like, bog down the United States military. Like, we definitely killed more of them than they killed of our soldiers. Yeah. But, like, the IEDs, the green on blue attacks, or the blue on green attacks, and all these things, like, that weighs over time. And, like, you know, the Afghanis, poorest country in the world, or if not, like, third poorest country in the world, bogged down the Soviet army and then the U.S. army just a decade or so later. So it's not, the average American is probably more armed, and the average American who might be rebelling against the federal government probably better trained than the average Afghani. So freaking subscription notifications. Sorry about that. But yeah, like they, so yeah, like these guys that are survivalists, that can hunt their own food and do all that, like, and know their area better than any soldier that we're gonna send in to occupy that area. Yeah, they pose a significant threat. Remember that Big Bear guy, the one who decided to go after the police? Like, it took hundreds of cops to go get that guy. He was like a former cop, but he was also former military.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it took, look at, that's one guy, and he had the entire state of California terrified. Like, imagine, you know, 200 of those guys, and you sending in a military where people, you can't send people from those local areas because they might be sympathetic to those people. Like, we have 300 million guns in civilian hands in the U.S. We only have 3 million soldiers, like, total. Like, it's not rocket science to know that this would be a terrible outcome for the country. But I just, I hope it's not going to get to that point.
Yeah, no, I don't think it will, and I certainly hope it doesn't. But, you know, I was trying to think of a parallel, a modern parallel, like what a U.S. quote civil war would look like. Look just south of the border. So if you look at Mexico and the war that the government's having with cartels, they're basically little civil wars within different states. So these cartels operate as if they're their own government in certain areas, and they're competing with the broader federal authority. So a lot of them will provide certain civil services to the people that they basically claim territory over. And these guys are fairly well armed. You know, if they're selling a lot of stuff on the black market, they get access to arms. You know, I was talking about how would you get, you know, who would fund or arm, you know, certain states in the U.S. If they can get their hands on certain weaponry, you don't have to have, you know, China or Russia or someone like that. Like, well, we don't want to get in a nuclear war. You could have someone just like one of the Mexican cartels, the Sinaloa cartel or something like that, say, hey, we got some of these extra rockets or something. You want some of these for a premium? And that's when things could get very strange and weird. And I don't think it will get to that point. But as things keep getting crazier in this country, it's like, why rule out anything at this point? But
and also, like, there was a gun buyback in California, And I'll never forget this because two people, not one, but two people showed up with RPGs to the gun buyback that they just had on them. And those are the people who are trying to sell their RPGs. Like, God knows how many crazy freaking items are out there among the general population. Like, so yeah,
Yeah.
it's I mean, it's a scary thing to think about. Like, we're laughing about it because it is kind of goofy, like people out in the woods like fighting the military. But like people who are like, oh well, what are you gonna do? Use your AR-15 to fight against the government? They have nukes. Like you're not gonna nuke something if you're trying to save it. Like, and again,
Yeah.
we've had nukes the whole time in Afghanistan and Iraq. It didn't do us much good because we're not using them on that foreign territory, let alone using it on
Yep.
the domestic. I mean, you see how crazy things get in front of the White House when those mostly unarmed, at least not having guns, Antifa losers are out there. And like that situation gets serious because just the raw numbers of people is scary. Like we saw the Air Force flipping out over the storm Area 51 thing. Which, by the way, if you have 100,000 people storming anything, let me be clear, that will
Uh,
100% work. So, like, that's why they were freaking out about it. They had to get Facebook to take down that event, even though it was a total joke.
yeah. Yep.
Like,
No, for sure. Well, so one other thing I was going to mention, um, when it comes to why I'm so concerned about why we need to get people to de-radicalize, as technology becomes more advanced, a lot of things that can be used to harm people become cheaper. So if you have a drone, a consumer drone, what are some of the things cartels and other people like Al Qaeda affiliated people starting to do? They're putting bombs and other devices strapped to consumer drones, and all of a sudden you have something that costs like $1,000 and you can turn it into a bomb that can fly.
yeah.
And that's not something we had to worry about, not even 10 years ago, or especially 20 years ago. um, if people start to realize that, or you got people 3D printing guns, and that's still kind of like an early stage, but that's becoming more and more advanced. Like society needs to figure out how to get along better, because it's becoming way too easy for us to destroy one another. And so yeah, that's my big focus, is how do we get people to talk more, or when they have a problem, maybe to stop talking, but also to not attack each other, just let people be. And that's my main interest.
Right. So I have a couple quick questions in this vein.
Yeah.
I know you're hoping for de-radicalization, but I have a feeling a radicalizing event is on the is on is in our near future. So I've
Yeah.
looked at the evidence in the George Floyd case. I can already tell you right now for sure, like take it with you, money to the bank, that 3 of those 4 officers have 0% chance of being convicted. Chauvin's the only one that's
Yeah.
questionable, and every single post original video development seems to cut in his favor. If he is found not guilty on all counts, like they don't even tag him for a manslaughter, like what do you think the reaction is going to be to that? And that's going to be next year. It's not going to matter who's president, Biden or Harris. Like that's when the trial's going to happen. I how big if I
Oh
mean if
man.
if they arrested him 3 days after, and we're still rioting 100 days later. I mean, people are still rioting 100 days later. If they exonerate those cops, like what's this country going to look like? What's the city of Minneapolis going to look like besides Baghdad, which is what
Oh
it looks like
man.
now? Like,
Yeah, no, I know. It's something I've thought a lot about. I've examined the case, and I do think, if it goes to trial, and you just have to convince one jury member to say, okay, I see the plausibility that he may have already taken, was it fentanyl, that he was
right.
swallowing that or whatever, that he had a lot of it in his system. He was already having breathing problems before the knee on the neck. They might be able to convince someone that that's the case. That's all you need to get
Well,
for him to get off
Well,
with it.
they
So
charged him with it. They charged them with intentional murder. Even if none of this was the case, the idea that Chauvin and these other officers put Floyd in the position that they were trained to put him in this exact scenario to intentionally murder him is ridiculous. But cause of death is what's being called into question now. So that's why I'm like, it is not looking good for the prosecution. So
Yeah, no, I sadly have to agree. Like, I don't think like what happened, I think, is definitely illegal, and that the cops should not be doing anything of that sort, especially if it's someone who seems to be seems to have trouble breathing. The last thing you want to do is put your knee on someone's neck, and also the extra force where it's tough for the person to just breathe in general. So that whole scenario is just a complete nightmare. But by the narratives that are being pushed, it's only going to make things worse if he does, especially for Chauvin, if he gets exonerated. Yeah, I have no doubt that things will get very, very ugly immediately after that. And that was one of the reasons why I was thinking about leaving the country, because things are just so wild right now. There's so many things that could explode at any time.
right.
And
I do agree with
yeah,
you on the like you shouldn't put your knee on somebody's neck. Like I'm fully on board with the NYPD and where they've been on this issue since 1993. No neck pressure. And the reason you don't do that is because you don't know if somebody has a pre-existing condition that makes you vulnerable to that. The NYPD have been a perfectly fine police department. You know, actually they've been pretty good compared to other departments around the country with that rule in place. Like they had the violation obviously in the Garner case, even if it was for like a
right.
split second. But like I fully agree. But unfortunately, the Minneapolis Police Department prior to this did not agree. So if you're trying to prosecute Chauvin for a hold that they taught him is acceptable, then you're going to run into problems because that's not something that he even just
Yep.
came up with. He was trained to do that. And it's undeniable by that full footage
Yeah.
that Floyd was resisting, kicking, the whole 9 yards. So that's why I think a conviction for Chauvin is unlikely on either of the two murder charges.
Yeah.
Maybe you could tag him with the manslaughter, maybe, but I don't think
Yeah.
people are
I
going to be
agree.
happy with that because they already were not happy with the third-degree murder charge, which, based on the original video, was the highest charge that you could apply to that. So it's
Mhm.
it's crazy. Like I don't know. Like again, at least in Rodney King, I had a friend of mine, Devin Tracy, say at least with Rodney King, they actually waited for him to be found not guilty before destroying everything. Like, like,
Oh,
like
jeez.
Floyd, they started doing that from the jump. Even after they arrested him, even after they upgraded the charges for no goddamn reason, there was nothing to justify that. And even after they arrested the other cops and charged them with absurd, extra charges. Like, I'm sorry, that Asian cop who's doing crowd control, that is not aiding and abetting
Yeah.
second degree murder. I don't know, I know what the prosecution was thinking. It's a politically motivated charge, but like, I don't know what you're thinking long term
Mhm.
when that's going to be found not guilty. The only saving grace for them in all the developments I've seen so far is it looks like the officers are going to go with the strategy of blame each other, which means that when they go to trial, you're going to have cops testifying against cops. If they do that, then you're going to get some convictions out of this, likely. But
Yeah.
if they fight it together, like 3 or 4 are definitely going to win, and Chauvin's probably going to get off.
Yeah. No, that's probably the case. I agree. And what's most heartbreaking about this whole thing is, after Floyd died, like that itself is clearly a tragedy. The whole thing, should have never happened. But it was one moment where pretty much the whole country was in agreement that something horrible had happened, that the police were responsible. And I thought it would finally be a good time to have discussion about police tactics and the things that they do, or with the Breonna Taylor case and similar no-knock raids that go horribly wrong. It was a time to talk about all that stuff, but like now all that reform has just been moved off the table. And
Well, they did pass Breonna
oh,
Taylor's
it drives me
law
nuts.
in Kentucky. Like that one did happen, which is interesting because when you look into the details of her case, it's not the best example of a no-knock warrant going wrong. Like there have been stories where people showed up to the wrong house, broke down the
Yeah.
door
Mhm.
and then shot somebody, or somebody shot at the cops. Like I remember one in Mississippi where a guy shot a cop and killed the cop, but he did so right in front of his daughter's like bedroom door because he thought people were breaking into the house. And the video footage showed that they didn't even announce themselves and it was the wrong house. Like
Yep,
Breonna Taylor, like
I
it's a
remember that.
myth that she was the wrong house. If you look at the documents, her name and address and social security number is on the warrant. They were going there because her previous boyfriend was receiving his drug packages there. But yeah, like should we get rid of these militarized raids? For sure. The boyfriend, the current boyfriend, the one that shot at the cop and hit him in the femoral artery, he did so because he thought
Hmm.
that they were that it was the other guy, the actual drug dealer, like breaking into the house because that's why he was on edge. But
Yeah.
that like so like should we get rid of those raids? 100%. Is Breonna Taylor really the best example of that, considering they knocked and like that
Hmm.
wasn't the wrong house? Probably not. But I am glad for the policy that they ended up implementing, and I'm glad that there's a push for it nationally, like to kind of
Yeah.
because there's no reason you talk to old school sheriffs and there's no reason in 90% of these no knock cases that they can't stake out the place and wait for the people to be outside and stop them on their way out. Like when you break into
Yes.
somebody's
Exactly.
house, that's like an aggressive move and it's inviting pain. And this is why libertarians have been on this no knock warrant thing for a decade. Like go to
Yeah.
reason.com, you'll find articles about this 10 years old about these scenarios and legit ones, not necessarily the Breonna Taylor,
Oh,
which is more myth than fact. So I am happy for that reform. It sounds like you're on board with that reform. Um, what other reforms do you think
yeah.
that the police should go for? Even though I think we shouldn't be talking reforms until the rioting stops. Like, what are some of the things you would want to do?
Yeah. So something I'm very interested in is, so I'm a libertarian myself. Um, I'm interested in charterizing police, kind of the same way what we've done to schools. And there's this, and we have to get rid of police unions. Having a system where they're accountable financially, where they're not automatically going to get a certain amount of funding each year, especially if the person running it is doing a bad job. That's currently how the charter school system works. If you're not fulfilling what you've contractually set out to do, you no longer get funding. The contract goes to someone else that has a chance to try and prove themselves. Um, and if you have, just like in charter schools, if you have bad teachers, you don't have a union that can protect them, get rid of them. If it's for same thing for a cop, if you're a bad cop, you don't have a union that can protect your job that's making sure that they get the dues from you. I think we need to experiment with something along those lines. But even if you don't have a charter system, you have to get rid of public sector unions. I think
Right.
just the way they function, they're inherently corrupt, and if not the biggest, definitely one of the biggest
Yeah.
issues.
I mean, the police union. Look, all these unions are meant to make it harder to fire their members, and that includes bad members. Like they say they're not for protecting bad cops, but like it's part of the if you pay dues they're supposed to protect you. It's part of their thing, and I understand the incentive structure for them. I don't even begrudge them for that because they're just operating, they're playing the game. Like that's what their role is in the game. I would definitely
Yeah.
severely limit public sector unions across the board, not just with police. I'm not sure about the charter idea. I would have to look into that a little bit further, but I do like the
Mhm.
move that New Jersey did when they had that. I think it was the Trenton Police Department, and the union had made it impossible for them to get any of the officers actually out on the street. So they're financing an entire department, and they can only get a dozen cops out in one of the most dangerous cities in New Jersey for a single night. So the state actually got rid of them
Yeah.
and like dissolved the police department and created like the New Jersey Metro Department, took it away from the city council, and they've had much better results. But that actually, even though the left will use that as an example of defunding the police, they hired twice as many officers. Like they just took it out of the hands of the union, and service by the people of Trenton's own standards went up significantly. Like they were more satisfied with their
Mhm.
police department, and that went along with a
Yeah.
lowering of crime. So I do think that some of these entrenched departments could use, being dissolved over time and reconstituted and maybe handed off to a different body to supervise. And I have no problem doing that, every seven or, every 10 or so years, like just if there's continued problems. because sometimes
Yeah,
the union does bake in a system that's destined to fail.
definitely. Yeah, I think another big thing is police resources have to be directed to things that are, I think, actual problems, and well, and also get rid of, stop directing resources to things that I feel like they shouldn't touch. So I'm hugely against the war on drugs. Um, I think not just for marijuana legalization or cannabis legalization, basically all drugs should be legalized. I know a lot of people, they're hard to get on board with like legalizing heroin and stuff like that. But places that have done it seem to be doing much better. Switzerland has an interesting program where if you're a heroin addict, they have clinics you can go to where they'll actually supply you with a clean needle and medical grade heroin, basically. But you have to inject while under supervision. And a lot of those people, when they go to the clinic, they have a chance to get other help.
Yeah.
Typically, if you're someone that's using a hard drug like that, you have other issues in your life. That's why you went to something like that, to such an extreme. And when people have connection and ways of dealing with what other issues they have, more likely to get off of it, as opposed to in the U.S., if you get caught with heroin and you go to prison, your life was already miserable. Well, now you're in prison, and then when you get out and you want to try and get a job, well, if you have a felony on your record, you can't get a job. So you're like, well, what else can I do? Well, maybe I can get involved in the drug war, and that's a place where I can make some money. And then you're like, well, if you want to get involved in the drug war and you're going to start selling stuff, you got to join a gang, and then you have to start getting violent. Well, then violence starts to increase, and you have more crime, and like the whole drug war is just a one big giant mess. And I've always said, like, the key thing to police reform is recognizing things like the war on drugs, how much it affects society as a whole, and how the cops operate in general. When it comes to police militarization, most of that started after the war on drugs really kicked in. And that's when cops became, in many ways, more militaristic than the U.S. military themselves. Like their rules for engagement on when they can shoot they have a lower standard than what someone is fighting in Fallujah or something in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever. So,
I mean, typically you're supposed to, your rules of engagement. I know Fallujah is a civilian force, like an insurgent force, but typically your rules of engagement are based on the idea that, like, I'm putting it on a uniform and I'm going after you with a uniform. It's not like a traffic stop that can go wrong in a split second. So I understand, like, why the cops aren't the military, so I understand why they don't have the same rules as the military.
yeah,
But
yeah.
to your point about Sweden, Portugal actually has the same thing with injection sites.
Or Switzerland.
Oh, Switzerland, my apologies.
Yeah,
Like
no, it's all good.
I'm fully on board with. I would trade every single needle exchange program in this country that leaves hundreds of thousands of needles on the street, like San Francisco, for injection sites where people can do it under the supervision of a doctor. If they overdose, then they have
Yep.
they have the cure there that they just pop them in with. 100% on board with that for these people, because I do believe addicts are sick. Ramping down the
Yeah.
drug war would also, there's a lot of policing that's busy work that the cops don't really need to be doing, so I'm totally fine with getting rid of
Yeah.
that. But it's you also have to prevent mission creep, because a lot of, like, really good programs end up becoming expanded because it's the government, so they think, oh well, if this is showing good results, just do that more and therefore you'll get good results, and all you really end up doing is pissing people off. Like, a great example of this is broken windows policing. Broken windows policing
Hmm.
works if you do it correctly and kind of in New York City, because the number one broken windows crime was jumping the turnstiles. Because the thought process behind it was, if people jump the turns, if the people who are robbing people in Manhattan, in inner Manhattan, the younger people, are probably not paying for the train. So if you stop them at the point of entry, you'll see a reduction in thefts and other issues downstream in other crimes. And they did that and it worked, but
Yeah.
somehow that got misinterpreted, and there's mission creep into saying that broken windows should be about enforcing every single little ticky-tack crime to the maximum extent. And that's how you get a bunch of people that are really pissed off because they're being ticketed for their, like, car registration, which leads to no crime down the line. They're being ticketed for jaywalking,
Yeah.
again, no crime down the line. and other petty offenses that don't really do anything. So, like, you have to tailor the programs to your specific regions and actually look at the results of that. Like, another thing I do agree with broken windows is, like, you got to clean up graffiti after it goes up, because if a place looks like crap, people are going to treat it like crap. Like, if you don't believe me, go to a park that's really nice, dump a whole bag of recyclables there, and come back in a week. You come back in a week, it's gonna be a pile 10 times bigger, because people are just gonna assume, oh, that's how things are here. So
yeah,
those two are fine.
absolutely.
Everything else, no. Like, everything else you got to do case by case basis if it actually has the impact, and you have to balance that with alienating the population that you're trying to help. So, like, I feel like as I've studied criminal justice more, I've become less libertarian, but not by much on certain issues. Like, if that makes sense.
No, sure. No, I hear that. So I haven't formally studied criminal justice, but it's something I've been studying on my own for quite a long time. And it's funny. There's times where, like, even though I'm super critical of cops, where I'm defending cops or different myths that I see people talking about. It's like I've seen you dispel a lot of these myths about, like, stop and frisk and stuff like that, and how it applies racially and stuff like that. There's a lot of myths that get tossed around. But yeah, it's sorry. Go ahead.
I was saying, yeah, there's definitely, and the thing I try to point out with stop and frisk is there was definitely mission creep in stop and frisk. Like, in New York, they made it illegal for you to arrest people for marijuana unless it was out in the open. And the NYPD were going up to people and saying, empty your pockets, take out a little bag of marijuana, it's out in the open, and arresting you. Like, that's nonsense. That protects nobody. And that's mission creep in the stop and frisk program. So there were problems. It's just the idea that it's racially targeted disproportionately is not the case. Like, if you look at that compared to its actual objective, the percentages are actually lower than what you would expect based on that objective, based on, the level of crime and the suspects and all that. But they did ramp up that program too much. They were just conducting way too many stops. Under Giuliani at peak, they did 90,000 stops. Under Bloomberg at peak, it was like 830,000. Like, that's crazy. And they weren't getting more arrests. Like, they were just pissing people off. So I'm fine with cutting that back, because A, it's not that effective, and B, it pisses people off and alienates them against the police, and C, it's a giant civil rights violation if you're just searching people for no reason. It used to be something happened in this area, and a suspect, you stop, you talk to him, it was stop, question, and frisk, and based on the questioning, you determine whether or not you need to conduct a search, which is fully in line with the Terry standard, from, like, I think it's Terry v. Ohio. So, like, under Bloomberg, it went crazy, and I understand why people were pissed off about it, but it wasn't racially disproportionate. That's just not the case.
Yeah. Another thing I believe is really important, that's not talked about a lot, is training for police, and how much time, compared to a lot of other so-called Western countries, how much an officer goes through training before they become an officer, and also ongoing training. I was listening to Joe Rogan podcast, I don't know, maybe it was a couple months or so ago. Jocko, I want to say Willink, I think that's how you say his last name, former Navy SEAL. He was mentioning about, when you're a SEAL, when you're a soldier, they're always doing drills. When they're not on a mission, they're practicing not just their gun skills, but they're doing, MMA, and these cops, they may get some basic hand-to-hand combat stuff when they're going through school, but then once they're done, maybe once a year they'll have, like, a little training session, but they're not doing it every week or multiple times a week. And you see some of these videos that end up really horrible, where someone gets shot or horribly injured. If the cops would have been able to restrain that person, or find a way to de-escalate it, so it's not, oh, now I have to go for my gun. Right. I think there needs to be more emphasis on that. But also, there needs to be a higher threshold of who can be a cop. And if there is going to be more training, I think you're going to have to start paying cops more, which I don't think is the worst thing. If you increase the pay, you'll have more people that be willing to do it. And if they get more intensive training, especially, I think having a stronger background in psychology, and de-escalation tactics and stuff like that. Like, I know a lot of people say you need to have mental health professionals for certain cases, but I feel like the cops should have a much solid base that they don't have to rely on someone else to be there when you have these instances of someone that is really,
Right.
snapped. Um, and it's not to knock like the cops, like in the current system that they're in, they don't get that training. Those things aren't required. And I think that's a huge problem. There needs to be a much bigger focus on that. Um, Hopefully that's something that we'll see more of.
Right. Well, what I would say is like, for sure, certain departments could use way more training. The problem is nothing is standardized in the United States. So like the NYPD, you require 60 college credits, which is basically, unless you're an idiot and you're just taking random stuff, then it's an associate's degree in order
Yeah.
to go into the police academy. You also have to be 21 years old. In Suffolk County, which is not that far in Long Island, it's the highest paid police department in the entire country, and I actually think the world. Like you make like 118K over there. So people come from around the world to
Wow.
take their entrance exam, and that's how they screen people. But a lot of these like local departments, they don't have, they live in a small town. They need a certain amount of people to be cops, so the standard kind of meets the like what they have. But there are other cities, like to your point
Yeah.
about mental health, like San Antonio has a crisis intervention team, which are officers that are trained to recognize the signs of mental distress, and they actually shoot, compared to any other Texas department, like way less per capita people that they encounter because they have a specialty unit that's trained to deal with that. So like there's a lot of different things that you could do, but it's like hard to compare the Navy SEALs, which is a federal organization, to the police because
Yeah.
like the NYPD, their academy's like what? Let's say it's 12 weeks. I don't know that for sure. It might be 8. Right? It's 12 weeks. That's
Sure.
not a lot of training, but like basic is around that amount of training for the military, and then they give them like some bullets once a month to go shoot at the shooting range, and then they say they give you credit if you go do this kind of training or that kind of training. Like a lot of times in these little like small departments, the reasons that the officers go for their guns so quickly is because unless you're a supervisor, like some higher rank, you don't have a taser. Like you don't have pepper spray because whatever the local government decided that you're allowed to carry is what you're allowed to carry. So if all you have is a baton and the person is like further away from you than a baton would make sense to use, and a gun, like I'm going to go with the projectile weapon. And that's a lot of times what you're seeing in these cases is that there's no standardization in training, there's no standardization in what the cop has on them, and there's a lot of like erratic situations where it's a judgment call that you make in a split second. So we should be training people to make better judgment calls in those split seconds, but there's not money for that. And again, sometimes you don't have options. Like I can give you all the judo training you want, like, but some guy is there with a knife and all you have is some pepper spray or a baton. I'm
Yep.
sorry, or a firearm. You might end up using the
Mhm.
firearm.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's definitely complicated, and I think that's one of the bigger issues is people don't seem to be concerned with nuance. Um, People want to try and simplify things too much, and I realize how complicated any given scenario when a cop's dealing with someone. But even like with guns, so with cops, I think in almost all cases they have hollow point rounds, something that does way more damage than traditionally what militaries use, so-called full metal jackets, and because the hollow points spread and expand when they go into someone and does some really awful things, and that's why typically when people get shot by cops, a lot of them don't survive. Um, Part of the reason why they use hollow points is not to do more damage; it's because it won't pass through the person and potentially injure someone else. Or if it's in a house, one of those things, if it goes through a wall, it's not going to go very fast. You're not going to accidentally hit someone in another room. Um,
And it
so it's
has
like,
it
well, are
has
there?
it has stopping power too. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
It's like you
no, for sure. So I try and think, well, what if is there some type of round that can still incapacitate someone, potentially kill them? You hear the term less lethal. Like
right.
even a taser is considered to be less lethal. It does kill people occasionally in rare circumstances. But is there still a fairly reliable, less lethal round that cops can resort to? But the potential problem with that is, if you're like, oh well, this thing's less lethal, I don't mind using it.
Yeah.
It doesn't have hollow points, so then maybe more people will die because cops might want to use that instead. So you have these really tough conundrums where it's like there's no simple way of solving them.
That's actually why a lot of low-ranking officers don't have tasers, because it was less lethal, and officers are popping them off into the chest. And you know, if you get hit with the taser in the chest, it's not less lethal by much. Like, it shocks you in between a heartbeat, you're done. So yeah, that's why we have restrictions for that. It is a complicated issue. I didn't even think of the rounds in a cop's gun being designed to not, you know, go through a wall and hit somebody else. Like, you know, obviously there are a bunch of people that thought of this, and you know, they have reason. There's like reasons for everything that goes around with these officers, but yeah, like I wouldn't mind if they were better trained. Like, if you're a firefighter or a state trooper, like, state troopers are no joke. They have to take a physical examination every single year, and they're trained like a paramilitary kind of organization, because a state trooper, like, they're trained to go out alone. Like, police departments, they train you to go with a partner. That's why they're more lax, because if you don't got something, your partner's got your back. But, like, you know, state troopers act as Secret Service for our governors, basically. And when they're out there, like, you know, with Smokey the Bear hat, you notice that guy's alone. The reason that guy's alone is because he doesn't need anybody else to beat your ass. Like, he's going to deal with it. And I think the state troopers have a much better record overall than your run-of-the-mill, like, your police departments. And sheriffs probably have a worse record because, you know, sheriff's elected, and then he chooses the guys that are kind of around him for his department and sets the policy. So, like, we have completely different origins for different law enforcement entities, different practices. Like, even within the same states, even within the same jurisdictions, you know, you could interact theoretically with the police department officer, a sheriff's deputy, and a state trooper. They've all gone through different training, they all have different practices, and they all are equipped completely differently. So, like, it's very complicated, and while, you know, easier said than done is to get your police to be like state troopers, like, that money is, like, you know, like, you're gonna have to flood these departments with money, and you can't even think about, like, the defunding the police, because when you cut something from a union-based organization, the first place a union will agree to have cuts is for the new people coming in. Like, not for the people who are already members. You know, like, you get your 3 years and then you're a solid union member. So that's where the money's gonna be removed from, the training, not from the not from these guys that are, you know, making too much money, like, pushing paperwork. Like, those guys are your big union contributors. Right. So
for sure.
It is really complicated, and I don't know. Like, I like the body cams. The unions were totally wrong about the body cams, because those have exonerated, you know, what, 100 times more cops than they've actually condemned.
Absolutely, yeah. There should be no excuse at this point for not having them. So, you know, it's just really to kind of where we started, and, you know, with nuance, not just in policing and how complicated things can be. You know, just talking about politics in general. You know, when people get so ideological, or they want to try and keep things so simple, it's like that's the one thing that seems to escalate things, is when people don't allow for nuance at all. And just look at everything that's happening right now between the riots, or the political polarization between Biden supporters and Trump supporters. When people start thinking others are evil, or it's like, even if you don't like the police and you think they're evil, it's like things are so complicated. We need to find ways to deal with them and be open, and even if it's tough, just try your best to be civil, because otherwise you're not going to get to the heart of the matter, and that just makes it worse for everyone.
So we didn't touch on this, but we did touch on Rittenhouse. What's your take on the Ryan Hall guy, the one in Portland, who shot the Antifa guy, who shot the Patriot Prayer guy, and how the media reacted to that, even though, like, as more evidence comes out, it's pretty clear that this guy ambushed him.
So when it first happened, I remember hearing reports that the guy who was killed drew bear mace or something like that. I later heard that his bear mace got shot. That's
Yes.
what, it wasn't him firing it. So that seems like a very different thing. Especially after seeing the other video, it looks like it does seem targeted. And after Rittenhouse incident in Kenosha, like I just assumed something like this was going to happen, where it's like, oh, okay, now someone on the left is going to feel justified to target someone they see on the right, and like clockwork, sadly, it already happened. I think that case was pretty clear cut. Now he's dead. Now that's another thing people are polarized on. Did Trump strictly send people to execute him? Did he have a gun and all that kind of stuff? It's like, I don't see why they would want to just outright shoot and kill the guy, because that's not going to look good, especially if it turns out he was unarmed. But yeah, I'm not exactly clear on what happened in that scenario. I don't think anyone is at this point. But
the marshals who were on the scene, I don't know if they pulled the trigger because they were working in conjunction with the Washington police, because he fled the state. They say he presented a gun when they pulled him over, meaning he came out of the car with a gun, which is an act of aggression. Witnesses say he fired on the SUV that the officers were in, but I haven't gotten confirmation from like the marshals, because they released a very like no information statement. Like, we stopped him, he presented a gun, we took him out. Like they gave you no extra information whatsoever. But I think the initial shooting, a bullet did hit his bear mace can, but the reason it was out is apparently two other individuals, because I was reading the warrant for Ryan Hall, approached them and they threatened their lives. And the guy who got shot, I believe his name is Gibson, he had a gun on him. Like, it was holstered when they found his body. He didn't take it out. He took out a knife stick, like a collapsible baton, and it was still retracted, and the can of bear mace, right? And that's the kind of fight he thought he was getting into, like something that would require mace. And the Reinhold guy, he's on the surveillance video from the stills in the warrant, like stalking him, hiding behind a parking lot, and like that looks like a targeted hit. And one of the reasons why I know he's really sketchy is because it was reported in the press that this guy had a knife on him, the victim of the shooting, but he had actually gone home and dropped the knife and the paintball gun, or like he didn't have the paintball gun. It doesn't matter. He didn't have what was on him in the photos earlier in the day on him at the time. But this guy was like reading media reports. That's why in the Vice interview, he's like, oh, well, he had a knife on him and he was threatening to kill people with a knife. And it's like, no, like, you're bullshitting. Like, and I think Vice, they did a great job going to get that story. It is a story. If you're in, you worked as a journalist, like, you get that interview if you can.
Oh yeah, no, it is amazing that they got him to admit to it.
Yeah. Well, semi, but I'm saying, you get that story, but like watching that video and knowing that the trailer came out early in the morning and he kind of, rage quit life when the cops pulled him over, it seems like that was his like martyr message, and like that's why he chose Vice to deliver that. And so like it becomes sketchy later, but I understand, like, even though I'm not a journalist, like, you gotta get that interview. If somebody calls you and they're like, we have an exclusive from the guy, like, go get it.
Oh, definitely.
Like, but what's your take on the disparity in reaction? Because in my mind, we have Rittenhouse, and I would say the same thing if Rittenhouse was the lefty Antifa and Reinhold was like a right winger. We have Rittenhouse on video, and according to the witness from the Daily Caller, acting in self defense, and you have Reinhold like ambushing the guy again on video, clearly not acting in self defense. And it's not even like people are condemning both. They're literally telling you that Rittenhouse went and engaged and looked for a fight, and Reinhold was defending somebody or himself. Like, it's just like, don't believe your lying eyes because of the teams. Like, I can't think that's good, especially if you're worried about, the potential for more violence. Like that.
Yeah.
But what's your take on it?
I do my best to try and look at, I don't like saying both sides, because there's almost always multiple sides to any scenario, and I'm always tracking social trends and trying to figure out like why people believe what they believe. Um, but it's amazing. It's like most people, they don't go by their own reaction. They react to someone else that they trust's reaction. Um, that's what's really terrifying is people. One thing they suffer from critical thinking. I'm trying to think who came up with this term. They also lack critical feeling. They don't think about their feelings and where they come from, how easily they're instigated by their social circles or people they follow in the media. And when people can be, especially if you watch the Rittenhouse incident, because to me that's much more clear what happened than on the other video. So when the first one came out with Rittenhouse, which was the second set of shootings, it was like, okay, if this guy was fleeing after he just deliberately murdered someone, that was like the initial reports, like, okay, but then he clearly seemed to use self-defense. And then later on, the other video came out where you see him fleeing. I don't remember the other guy's name.
Rosenbaum.
Yeah, Rosenbaum. Yeah. And I was like, okay, this was clear-cut self-defense. How on earth did anyone, like, if Rittenhouse was considered to be on the left and he was getting chased by people on the right, would all of a sudden, even like if the exact same thing happened just with their politics flipped, would people still have the same reaction?
No, people would definitely flip. Like it would be shameful, but it would definitely happen. Like I try not to play that game with criminal cases because the law is what the law is. There's no, unless you're part of Antifa or unless you're in some goofy right-wing militia that cleans graffiti, then this doesn't apply to you. But like, yeah, people would 100% flip. And if the Reinhold one, which looks like an ambush, the original video is not anywhere near as clear, 100%.
Right. Yes.
But
definitely.
Like if that surveillance video came out, first of all, if the video showed again in Rittenhouse, the video showed basically the opposite of what they're saying, and they're flipping out about it. But if it was the right wing guy in Reinhold's position shooting like an Antifa member in the chest in cold blood, that would be national news right now. And then he went out in a blaze of glory against the cops. They'd be like, right wing terrorism is here. It's like they would erase 90 days of rioting, which is what they did in Kenosha anyway. Like 90 plus 100 days of rioting, and just pin it all on this one guy. Especially if he looked like a crack, the guy looked like a drug addict in that interview. So they'll be like, mentally unstable, lone wolf, liar. Look at all the proven lies that this guy had. So yeah, everything would be flipped if you flip the ideologies of these people, 100%.
Yeah,
like, without a doubt.
It's scary. And also what happened when Rittenhouse, when he walked away from the shooting, and then people on the left were complaining that the cops didn't just shoot him, thinking that anytime cops see someone armed, they're supposed to shoot him. Or they said if he was black or a person of color, they would have easily shot him. They'll just shoot any armed person of color. That's not true. There's so many. I see every single week at least some video that goes viral, at least like in the kind of libertarian sphere, of people that are critical of cops, and there's either footage from a person on their cell phone or body cam footage that was just revealed. I see countless scenarios where cops don't fire, but maybe something else bad that the cop does, but they don't just kill people all the time.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be a racial thing. And that's actually been one of my biggest problems with the discussion around police reform, is that people think it's racial. It's not. The amount of white people that get killed by cops each year, granted there's way more white people that live here in the U.S. than blacks, but still, it's more than twice most years that get killed, but you never hear about those stories. And I'm not saying that the media should only focus on those, and you shouldn't only focus on when someone gets shot and killed, because half the time when someone gets shot by a cop, the person is armed, or they're trying to go for a gun, or the officer is gun, or they have something else that's lethal, and it could be arguably justified. Like, there's so many other instances that are open that you can see very clearly of a cop, hitting someone for no reason, shooting dogs, even ones that are chained up, or if they're a small dog, it's not a threat to them. There's so many times where, or even if they shoot, they're trying to shoot a dog and they shoot a person instead, and you know, a
Right.
kid or innocent woman ends up dead. There's so many of these things that should have gone viral that the media, I feel like the mainstream should have been covering, and then we could have had healthy discussions about this stuff. But then if it just gets focused on one particular race, it's hard to get more allies for it when
Right.
things become polarized in that sense. So
Well, and
it drives. Oh, sorry.
I was saying, to your point, there are more white people than black people in the United States of America, but if you go per interaction, the rates of being killed by the police are identical. They might even slightly be a little bit within a statistical margin of error cut against white people for those scenarios. But you're right. And like, if you've been a libertarian for like more than 10 years, then you had to have noticed that at some point we stopped looking at police brutality at all. Like, where there were, cases. I remember one where they did a no-knock raid and they threw a flashbang inside this house. They just broke the window of the living room, threw it in there.
Yes.
That's the kid's playpen. They
The baby
burned,
crib.
yeah,
Yep.
they burned the child, and like, we used to get stories like that, or a woman's drunk in jail, and the cop comes in because she's loud, and he shoves her, and her face hits like that concrete like bed. She loses a bunch of her teeth.
Yep.
Like, we used to do police brutality stories, and then all of a sudden, we, instead of going, it's like Black Lives Matter almost like helps the police in that, like, actual reforms that the police should go. Like, Black Lives Matter works against them, because we narrowed all these cases of police brutality that happened to black people, happened to Hispanics. We never hear about the Hispanics at all. Happened to white
Yeah.
people, and we narrowed
Absolutely.
that to only black people. Then we narrowed that even further to black people getting shot, and then we narrowed that even further to unarmed, wink wink, because a lot of these guys are armed, black people being shot by the police, and we only highlight ones that kind of look sketchy up front and never follow up on them. Like Michael Brown kind of looked sketchy if you weren't paying attention, even though the forensic evidence is crystal clear and nobody's followed up on it. Like, we're still talking about Mike Brown, who, if you were going to script a justified shooting, would have acted in the exact way to get shot by the police. When we have all these police brutality things that didn't go away, they're still being caught on film, they're still being posted online, they're just, getting a couple hundred views instead of hundreds of thousands of views. I mean, think about how much we heard about Amy Cooper, the woman who got into an argument in Central Park with the other guy.
Oh.
She called 911 on him. By the way, he admitted to doing the exact thing that she called 911 onto him for in his original Facebook post, right? I guess it was a dog mom fighting with some bird watching, like, basically two annoying people that complain at each other. That was the story, right? Like, and that was like a racial like thing. She got fired from her job. It's like who the hell cares? Like, a guy didn't want, like, a dog not on the leash. This is the entire story. He took out dog treats because he's that petty of a person and was luring her dog there. The dog mom freaked out and called 911 because the dog was going towards him, and he made it seem like he was going to he said he was going to take her dog, right? That's what he said in his own Facebook post, right? That's a national story. People getting beaten by the police, who cares? Was it a black guy? Did they die? Was the cop white? Like, no interest. Like, that's why we don't get real reform, and that's why people are rioting, because they're like, they have this misperception that this is like the most common event in America, when it's like a double unicorn, when it's an unarmed black person being shot by the police and it's a white cop doing it. Because, by the way, by the numbers, black and Hispanic cops use deadly force at higher, like, are way quicker to escalate to that. Like, so it's insane.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I'm glad you brought up Michael Brown, because when that first happened, well, especially as all the evidence rolled in, it seemed to be clear that the hands up, don't shoot thing was wrong. When you try and use a case for, that police brutality is a huge problem, and it turns out that it wasn't police brutality, or at least it looks fairly clear that that was not the case, especially for a lot of people, they're fairly certain that Michael Brown was in the wrong. Then people, the next time, it's the boy who cried wolf story, where, do it for so long that people stop paying attention, even when there is these problems still happening. So every time they focus on a justified shooting, and they portray it as unjustified. The next time something happens, they'll just ignore you, and then you don't get any and the reform that you were initially hoping for. So you do at least as big of an injustice by promoting these false narratives, and that's what really makes my blood boil. It's insane.
Yeah, and the thing is when they get paid for this, everybody starts thinking, like, the fact that the Michael Brown family got paid a ton of money when the forensic evidence is airtight against Michael Brown. It's not even a question. 3 autopsies. They just elected a district attorney on the promise that he would reopen the Michael Brown case. That's what he ran on. He had to give a press conference with his tail between his legs, and he's like, "Yeah, we don't have anything." Yeah, and they're mad at him. They're like, racial traitor, like, sellout.
Yeah.
And then they elected a woman she won her primary, who was running on Michael Brown. It's like the myth that will not die. Like, it's not close. Officer Darren Wilson's account is so accurate. It's eerie because eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. Brown reached for the gun. It's crystal clear, and we're still talking about it. Presidential candidates. Like, Biden was like, this is the anniversary of Michael Brown being murdered. It's like, well, go tell Barack Obama, because his Justice Department completely cleared Officer Darren Wilson. Like, it's insane. So yeah,
for sure.
That definitely does hamstring our ability to go to look at actual police reforms, because we're always debating, again, these very, like, in terms of the grand scheme of problems with policing, like, just by the numbers, these are the extreme minority of cases. And then when you're lying about those, like, it makes it impossible for us to talk about any legitimate reform.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, so we've been at it for like an hour and a half. Do you want to closing thoughts, and, like, let us know where you're gonna be and where to find you and all that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm starting a new podcast. So I'm looking to launch it in the next month or so, and I guess it kind of surrounds some of the themes and stuff we've talked about. What I want to do is to interview people within, especially the YouTube political sphere, and even potentially people from the mainstream, intellectuals from different parts of the political and philosophical spectrum, but not just to hear what they have to say or what they believe, but I want to figure out why. What are certain issues that people, what brought them to their ideology, to certain stances on things, especially the ones that they hold the strongest, and through Socratic dialogue, to dive deep into how they can justify their beliefs, and if they can't, if they say, I'm not sure, this is just something I feel that is right, that's fine. But the goal is for the audience to hear other people, to give a better perspective, to create empathy, try and figure out why do so many people believe different things. So it could be the way they were raised as kids, or experiences they had in school, movies or TV shows they watch, a country they grew up in. Like, there's so many different factors, and I think too often for most interviews, it's just talking about what people think and not why. And I feel like that's a much more interesting thing to dive into. And there's not any single person I wouldn't be willing to talk to. I think that's another thing. So, Sean, you may recall Daryl Davis. He was at the event we were both at last year. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Daryl Davis, he's a black jazz musician who de-radicalizes Klan members. And he's had countless interviews done about him. There's a documentary about him. He's done TED Talks, stuff like that. To me, he's one of the most inspirational people I've ever seen. And the way he de-radicalizes Klan members is he starts having conversations with them. And over time, these people realize the humanity in Daryl, and that whatever they've been taught when they were growing up was a bunch of nonsense. And their way of signifying that they're leaving the Klan is they hand in their robes to him. And through both directly and indirectly, he's de-radicalized something like 200 Klan members. And when I think of, this is a total extreme. I don't think everyone needs to try to talk to Klan members or someone that's that extreme. There's so many people who won't even talk to a Trump supporter or a Bernie supporter or whoever. I want to show that you can have productive conversations, that you have extreme disagreements with. And, even for me, someone who's a libertarian, anyone else who's a libertarian probably knows that libertarians have tons of infighting all the time about a million different things. And there's so many different brands, let alone if you fall between Republicans and Democrats, like in most cases, they probably hate you equally, but for different reasons. But I've always been able to manage to have good conversations with most people in most cases, and as long as someone is in good faith, wants to openly talk about what they believe and why, and maybe I want them to potentially learn something as well. Like I think most people they don't dive deep into the beliefs they have, and when you're listening to someone dig into their own thoughts, you as a viewer can do the same. Like, okay, why do I have this stance? And how do I defend this? And if you can't defend it, not to automatically change your position, but see if you can find supporting evidence, or if you have some sort of logical gap there. But at least being open to the idea that no one has all the right answers. We can all learn from each other, and if we continue to do that, you will see society start to de-radicalize, to chill out, and become more rational and hopefully happy and stable. Granted, that's something that takes time, but I don't think my one effort will be a sole solution, but you got to start somewhere, and hopefully other people, can do similar things. And yeah, that's what I'm looking to do.
Right. And Daryl Davis is fantastic. And you actually had, I know it was on Serververse back in the day, a great piece where he talks about how he started off doing this, and it's filmed right at the end of the in the after party of the event. And he was explaining that the people not talking to each other, even in the Klan, it goes so deep that a Klansman was in awe of the fact that a black man could play piano like Daryl Davis could. So that's how extreme of a gap that Daryl Davis is bridging with these people in the great work that he does. And honestly, there are political equivalents of that where people really genuinely believe. I mean, Jonathan Haidt has a great survey where he figured out that the more far left you are, the less accurately you're able to see the values of conservatives or even moderates in the country. So it is really important to bridge the gap, because a lot of times what you're reading as hatred for you is ignorance. These people just don't know you, and that applies to all sides of the political spectrum. I've had people tell me you could never talk to or date a left-wing person, and I'm like, I've dated a bunch of intersectional feminists. I live in New York City. Some they have beliefs I disagree with, but 99% of the time they're fantastic people. So it's about not seeing the ideology and actually seeing the person. And I'm hopeful I'll get invited on that podcast. But
well, it's funny you say that, because I was just gonna say I wanted you to be my first guest. So the offer is certainly open. I would love for you to be the first guest.
I appreciate that. As long as we avoid a Wednesday shoot, because I've had some problems.
All right, yeah, we'll definitely won't do Wednesday. That's a deal. Awesome.
All right, so I'm gonna link all your stuff in the YouTube video, but if you want to tell people where they should find you now, that would be great for the Twitch audience. And
yeah, sure. So you can follow me on Twitter at Ryan Lazarus. That's Shy short for Chicago. CHI. Also, I set up a YouTube channel. I don't have anything on there for this podcast that I'm building, but it's called Humble Intellect, and humble is spelled HUMMBULL. So that's where I'm looking to interview people like Sean and other people, like I said, all across both, not just the political spectrum, but I'm interested in metaphysics and religion and all that kind of stuff. So if you guys are interested in those types of things, I'm the type of person, I like to jump around from subject to subject. So it won't just always be the same thing over and over again. If you guys like variety, I think you guys will enjoy it. So yeah.
Definitely check out Ryan. Little behind the scenes thing, when I showed up in the back of the green room, he was one of the first people to approach me. He's a great guy off camera, not to mention super knowledgeable. All his links are going to be in the description. Thank you so much for joining me and having this discussion. I really do
Yeah,
appreciate it, and I wish you incredibly well during the podcast. I'm gonna drop the people off in a different stream because Twitch is goofy like that. But stay on the Discord.
okay.
I'll chat with you after. But yeah, thank you so
Okay.
much, and thank you to
Sounds good.
everybody who's tuned
Yep.
in. I do appreciate that. Oh, right quick, somebody says, I guess this was a question sent in. So, hey, Sean, great conversation. Thoughts on the issue of gun crime here in Chicago? We had a terrible month. I think we were talking about this earlier, where children were being killed, youngest 1 month old. Definitely need better. Yeah, I mean, we did touch on that earlier. I just want to make sure I got that.
Well, yeah. Well, a little bit just to add to that. So one thing I was going to mention, when people talk about police reform, I think the biggest issue is focusing on prevention and not cure. Why are these people shooting other people? So I mentioned briefly, a lot of it is tied to the war on drugs and, gang violence. But even before you get to that point, who are the people that become gang members? They are almost, in every case, high school dropouts, and they go to public schools here are terrible. They're well funded, but terribly run, which is a theme for most of the country. Like the amount spent per pupil, per student each year is, I think, like 3.5 times what it was 50 years ago, adjusted for inflation. But that's not going to better teachers. Actually, teachers make less than what they used to, adjusted for inflation, 50 years ago. It goes to excess administrators. And instead of having, updated technology and better teachers that can keep the kids engaged, or to have new curriculums that help prep kids for the modern economy, having internship programs or apprenticeship stuff like that, these kids don't have a lot of financial opportunities, and if they feel like they don't have any other options, they'll join a gang. And there's one group here in Chicago called Chicago Cred, and what they do is they train current and former gang members to give enough job skills so they can make roughly $15 an hour. Now, typically, most local drug dealers, low-level drug dealers in Chicago, they make roughly $10 an hour. If you can just help them get up to $15 an hour, they will happily take another job. But what the schools here currently produce, kids can't even make minimum wage, and so that's what they resort to. So if you can change the schools, we talked a little bit earlier about getting rid of the unions, the public sector unions, having more charter schools or private schools. I think that will go a long way. So you combine that with getting rid of the war on drugs, and you'll see gun crime drop dramatically. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of people talking about making those changes, so it's going to be here for a while. But I'm long term, I'm hopeful. I think the evidence is so overwhelming,
right,
and people are starting to understand what's going on, but it's not going to happen overnight.
Right. And I'm big on education. I have an entire video series about the problems in education, so I 100% agree on that. Something needs to be done about that, and I think that's a good place to leave it. Once again, follow Ryan on Twitter. I'm putting his Twitter account on screen right here for you guys. Great guy to follow. Picture with Daryl Davis, who we were just talking about. And thank you guys so much for joining the stream and or watching this on YouTube, where it's going to be later. I guess this is goodbye. Say goodbye, Ryan. Yeah, there you go. Wave.
All right, bye everyone.
All right, let me raid.